Okay, so this was round 4 of the 2022 St. Louis Norm Congress. So just to recap, this is like a 9-round round robin. I think you had to score like 6.5 points or something for a GM norm, but at this point I'm at half out of 3, so I'm not really thinking about the norm very much, and I'm more just trying to stop the bleeding actually, because I've lost 2 games in a row, especially round 3 was a very painful loss. It happened like this kind of very drawn end game, and that one was really brutal because that one just felt like I flushed a half point down the toilet. Every half point here is like so valuable. And yeah, going into this game, definitely wasn't feeling great. Like I'm paired against Grandmaster Vladimir Belarus. That's the one thing about these norm events. Like in an open tournament, if you do badly, you lose 2 games in a row, you're gonna start facing weaker players. Whereas in a round robin, the ratings are just kind of random and predetermined. So at this point, I lost 2 games in a row, but I'm actually playing Belarus, who was on 3 out of 3. He ended up winning the tournament actually, the 7.5 out of 9, just like insane score. Yeah, so tough, tough pairing. But actually, a little backstory. Last time we played was in an open tournament in I think it was January, with the same colors. I had black, and I had actually won that game. It was a very sharp King's Indian, and really interesting battle. So I did win the last game, so that definitely gave me some confidence going into this one. But we've played a number of times, and Bello still has a pretty big plus score. So he starts with c4. This is actually his usual MO. I go g6, and I'm kind of just inviting a normal King's Indian. But with this move order against like the English in particular, a lot of times I think it's nice that black can, let's say, switch to a setup with c5 and then bring this knight out to e7. So that's why I generally like starting with g6 and bishop g7 here, because at any point if white plays d4, black can just go in for a King's Indian, but I think it's more flexible against the different English transpositions. So he goes knight f3, and I wasn't really sure what to expect here. Generally, Belarus will transpose back into like a main line, like e4, d4, King's Indian. So I went d6, and here he plays g3. And at this point, white still has like a big choice to make here. So he plays like the fianchetto system, but after knight c6, d4 would be, let's say, direct transposition to the fianchetto King's Indian, and tons of theory here. But instead, white has a choice that he makes here with d3 to just kind of keep the position more in the spirit of like a typical English, which is like reverse Sicilian dragon. White plays for this plan of like rook b1 and b4, b5, and it just kind of gets this like very slow positional game. So yeah, I definitely wasn't expecting this one before the game, so I hadn't really reviewed much of anything here, but I stuck to the setup I usually play, which is to go with e5. White played rook b1, I went a5 here, white goes a3, so white's going to get b4 in, but at least black can trade the a-pawns and open up the rook on the a-file. Here I played rook e8, and this move is designed to play for the e4 push. So if white were to play like b4 here, then the idea would be to take, push e4. White's forced to kind of trade some stuff off here. Knight takes e4, rook takes e4. And as far as I remembered, I think black is supposed to be okay in this position. This is probably something I'll want to double check in terms of like opening theory. Yeah, as far as I remembered from my notes, black was supposed to be fine here. Like knight d4 might be my next move, trading off the knights, and yeah, slowly kind of equalizing the position. So instead of b4, white goes for bishop g5, which is, I think, a very typical move in this kind of position. And the idea is just to trade the bishop off for the knight, but of course it doesn't let black push e4, and this is like a typical exchange players often make in the structure where they give up the bishop, and now they have kind of 3 pieces that can fight on the light squares, whereas black has to kind of figure out what to do with the dark squared bishop, which can sometimes feel ineffective. So takes b4, takes. I played bishop g7, and I think I've had at least one game in this kind of position before, maybe in this exact position. In general, I feel like black doesn't really have much to fear here. The typical plan is to play like knight e7, c6, and push for d5, and just try to build a strong center. It's kind of like a reverse closed Sicilian, where that's a pretty typical plan that white plays in that kind of position, just trying to build for c6, d5, maybe bishop e6. There are other plans with just kind of like pushing on the king side. I feel like I might have had a game that went something like knight d2 and knight d4, and then I put my knight on e6 and started pushing like f5, g5. So you can also play like a kind of King's Indian. But in this game, white goes b5 right away, so I played knight e7, queen to b3, I pushed c6. I also thought about bishop e6 here. I think the moves are more or less equivalent, because the game went c6, rook a1, and now I played bishop e6. Although, yeah, it was definitely possible to exchange rooks as well and then play bishop e6, but I didn't really see why I should give up the a file. I don't think it's a huge deal because I think black is going to be getting d5 in pretty soon, and white doesn't really have a ton of pressure, but yeah, I think both ways are playable, so I just chose this way so that I could keep in touch with the a8 square. So he goes rook takes a8, queen takes, knight d2, and yeah, now basically I think white is just kind of playing against black, pushing d5. So here I don't think I have enough defenders on this one. And I think there's a lot of reasonable moves here, like I'm pretty sure I considered like rook d8 and stuff. But I settled on queen a5 here. I actually thought this was a pretty clever move because it comes with a couple of ideas. First, mainly, I actually just want to double on the a file and then start infiltrating, and then, you know, just start playing like just pushing for the advantage. It's kind of a classic advantage where you control the file, you try to infiltrate and use your more active heavy pieces. So that's kind of one thing white has to deal with. The second thing is I felt like it was actually kind of useful to x-ray these knights, because now the knight on c3 can't really jump to a4, and yeah, just putting a little bit of annoying pressure. There's also no easy way for white to kind of like harass the queen. So I thought this was kind of a nice move. Then my opponent goes knight ce4 here, and he's hitting the d6 pawn. And yeah, at this point in the game, I think starts to get kind of pretty tactical. So I want to say the main move I considered here was d5, because I felt like this would be the ambitious response, because okay, this is the push that black wants to get in. But then I wasn't sure what's happening here on knight d6. If knight c5, then I think, oh, knight's just hanging, right? So I can just take and I'm fine. But on knight d6, if rook d8, there's knight takes b7. So I was thinking rook a8 here is kind of a nice move, because this knight is still under attack. And yeah, actually, like, I didn't really see a great move here for white. And yeah, I checked with the engine later, and I think it believes black is doing quite well. Because this knight on d6 is kind of a little bit loose. I don't know, during the game I just wasn't sure. I didn't really want to enter these kinds of complications, but that might have been a miss on my end, because I really didn't see what was wrong with this position for black. But yeah, I wasn't quite willing to risk it. So I end up just playing rook d8, which I think is a more or less solid move, just defending the pawn and preparing d5. Here white takes, and goes queen b7. And yeah, this is actually kind of surprising for me, because when I was thinking about the position, you know, I just kind of anticipated that I would have rook d7 here, and then on queen b8 check, I would just go back rook d8, and it's not clear what white is doing with the queen. But I didn't think he was just gonna like repeat moves here. Of course, I was like, you know, definitely would have been happy with the move repetition, but I felt like that's not, didn't seem like, you know, he's just like playing for a draw all of a sudden. So I looked a little closer, then I realized like on rook d7, queen b8 check, rook d8, white has this move knight b3, counterattacking the queen on a5. And I don't have like a nice move here to, let's say, stay in touch with the rook. If queen a8, then white trades queens, and d6 will hang. But I can go for the endgame, and I was thinking about this position, let's say like d5, knight c5, and I don't know, to me it looked like black was probably fine, but maybe white had some pressure, although I definitely wasn't too concerned, especially have moves like rook b2, and yeah, seems like black should be okay, but okay, you never know. Sometimes, like, again, this bishop can end up being just very, very ineffective, especially on the battle on the queen side. So I ended up deciding to play rook d7, and then actually just drop back with the queen, which I think was a pretty solid choice. Because if white trades queens here, then after rook takes, okay, white's not super fast with knight b3, knight a5, and I can push d5 here a lot faster. So he goes rook b1, and yeah, I felt like white has a little bit of pressure here still, but generally I felt like I should be okay. And then I started calculating because I mainly wanted to push f5 here, because the knight is going to be forced to drop back, and maybe I can push d5 or something. But then I realized actually I can push f5 and e4 as well, kind of like a thematic break. And this actually looks pretty good, so I just ended up going for it, because it's a pretty nice idea. You hit the knight on c3, you open up the bishop, of course, which is useful. And then once the knight moves, I get to trade on d3 and kind of leave white with a more tangible weakness that's kind of easier to attack later on. Also, my bishop has kind of like a dream square on d4 now, and we can imagine some endgames where my rook ends up on the second rank, bishop on d4, and it's great that white doesn't have this move, e2, e3. So kind of a nice break to open up the bishops, and at this point I actually started feeling like quite comfortable. So I trade on b8, takes, king f7, and now white pushes c5, which I think is probably very smart move, because otherwise black was going to get rook a7, and once the rook starts infiltrating, it actually started to feel very unpleasant for white, especially if the dark square bishop and the rook end up attacking f2. But c5 kind of makes it hard for black, and I think the main move I was considering here was d5, which I think is probably the most ambitious move. Just locking down the bishop. Probably the move I would just play in a blitz game quickly. But then I was thinking white would go rook b4 most likely to control the d4 square, maybe push d4 himself, and yeah, I don't know. I wasn't sure. Seemed like black was fine. I didn't really know if black is better or could be pushing. I checked this with Stockfish afterwards. It does give black some edge here. So this is definitely a position I actually want to look at a little bit deeper to try to understand how actually I would play for a win in this one, because I end up just taking on c5, which I think is just kind of a very solid choice. Knight takes c5, rook a7, and now stuff kind of simplifies, but mainly the idea was that I'm able to get my rook to activate. And that was what I didn't like about this d5 line, was that after rook b4, it's not clear how my rook actually gets in. So by taking, I'm just kind of playing for the activity of my rook, and now I want either rook a1 check or rook a2, maybe both, bishop d4, and yeah, seemed like black is getting decent play. So here white played knight takes e6 and offered a draw, which I accepted pretty quickly. I did think about it a little bit, because I felt like at this point, I would probably rather take black here, just with my king being closer to the center. I think objectively it's just very, very drawish, especially with the opposite card bishops, but, I think, if white had the better winning chances, I don't think, he'd be offering me a draw. But, yeah, I didn't really see myself winning this one, and after 2 losses in a row, I was like, yeah, I think I'm pretty happy with this with this result. So we agreed to a draw here. So that was round 4.